Hello everyone, we're in the middle of a shorter section of Q&A videos than I've done in the past, partly because we're coming up to the Christmas season, so time is at something of a premium, as any parent will know. Getting organised for this is, tends to mean other things have to be pushed aside. So my plan is we'll do about 3 videos this week, of which this should be the second, and then we'll do a few more immediately after Christmas, that sort of time, when I've had a bit of time to recover and fit in some videos. So we'll end the year hopefully with a few less serious, lighter-hearted talks about this, that and the other. We might look at historical movies, just we looked at historical novels a while back, that sort of thing, and lots of Roman stuff, lots of Greek stuff, and other bits and pieces thrown in as well. Today we're going to go Greek. We're going to look at a question that was raised by the video I did about the movie 300 and the 300 Spartans and the famous stand at the pass of Thermopylae in 480 BC that led to the death of Leonidas and all his men. Within that, a few of the comments raised the question, well, what were the Greeks planning to do? I talked about this a little bit in the videos, but not to any great extent, because this was more about the films rather than the history. Now, you'll have to wait for my full take on this in a book until 2026, because I'm 2/3 of the way writing this book called Athens and Sparta, A Tale of Two Cities, which will look at the long 5th century. So we'll look a bit before earlier and we'll look a little bit later, but we're looking at how Athens and Sparta combined with other Greek states to oppose the Persians, and then by the Peloponnesian War and its aftermath, both of them were as eager as the other to take Persian money to fight against fellow Greeks. So it's how did that consensus break down? How did that happen? So this is one part of that wider story. It's important, though, when we look at this and when we try and understand questions of strategy, the intentions of either side, that we realise the limits to the sources, but also we try to place ourselves back in the position of people at the time without the benefit of hindsight. You know, we know this is going to be one of the great epics of the ancient world, that Xerxes will lead this vast army, allegedly 1 million, surely far more than that, and a huge fleet to Greece, and that in spite of this overwhelming power of the greatest empire in the world at that time, he will be defeated. He'll lose the naval battle at Salamis, he'll be defeated on land at Plataiaei, will retreat, and the Persians will never again invade Greece. And then jumping century and a half onwards, you'll have Alexander going with his Macedonian but also with Greek allies, supposedly to avenge this, will go and conquer the Persian Empire. We know all of that's going to happen. We know that Greek armies are going to assert a level of dominance over Persian armies that is just seen again and again, and the Greek hoplites tend to win when they come up against Persian troops. In 480 BC, people didn't know that. Immediate context is 10 years before, and the 490 BC expedition sent by Darius to avenge first of all, the Athenians and the Erythraeans, city from Euboea, this long island that's just to the east of the Greek mainland. They joined in the Ionian revolt of the Ionian Greek cities of the coast of Asia Minor, spread to other communities, Lydians and Carians and people like that as well, but a lot of it, the core of it was a Greek rebellion. The Athenians and Erythraeans briefly take part, help in the attack on and destruction of Sardis, which burned various temples, and then Legate and aren't involved in the rest of the rebellion that goes on for several years before it's finally suppressed. Persians always having a knack of persuading enemies to defect. So quite a few, there are significant contingents that either change sides or just run away before the crucial naval battle in 494 BC at Lade. And this is a pattern in all Persian offensives, that they get leaders and significant parts of the community they're attacking to switch sides and join them. And that's the case when they're fighting the Medes, when they're fighting the Babylonians, when they're fighting the Egyptians, when they're fighting in Greece. It's a very effective way the Persians operate, and the Persians have this big empire because they are really good both at warfare but also at diplomacy and political arrangements. Now in 490 BC, Darius had sent a fleet carrying an army that lands after capturing Eritrea on Euboea. It crosses the narrow strait there, it's stopped off at a few islands along the way, lands in Attica, in the district, the Deme, the Athenians would call it, of Marathon. that's just the other side, really, of a sort of range of low mountains between Athens itself and towards the coast. The Athenians, joined by the Plataians, muster an army of 10 to 11,000 hoplites, possibly not many other troops at all. There are slaves who volunteered and who seem to serve in the phalanx as hoplites, but again, that's a question for yet another day. The Persian army, there are no reliable figures for. Some of the ancient sources claim 100,000, which seems extraordinarily unlikely. There's talk of 600 ships, or warships possibly, depending on how you read it or how you interpret it. Modern estimates often go for 20, 25,000, but it's very much guesswork. And then there's whole debates about where are the Persian cavalry and all this sort of thing. But the basic truth, as remembered by the Greeks, of this battle is that the Athenians and Plataians charge. They charge at a run, so they go faster than usual, at least in the last stage of the attack. And although they're at first broken in the centre, their wings succeed, the wings swing back and take out the Persian centre that had broken through, and then there's a long pursuit over several miles as far as at least some of the Persian ships, with very heavy casualties. And for the loss of about 192 citizens, plus some Plataians, plus some volunteer slaves and all this sort of thing. That's fatalities, not wounded, so we don't know the numbers of wounded that were probably considerable, given the power of ancient weapons and the protective qualities of Greek armour. There were probably far more wounded, people who hits the limbs, that sort of thing, than there were fatalities. The Greeks win. They supposedly kill over 6,000 Persians, and the army re-embarks, makes a feint at Athens, or perhaps an attempt to land at Athens while the Athenian army is away, but the Athenians get back, they rush, and of course before this, famously you've had the news brought back by the runner, who's variously named depending on the sources, and he, again in later tradition, drops dead, but it's the origin of the modern marathon, very loosely. But again, we can talk about those sorts of things other days. And the Persians retreat, and the Persians don't come back for another 10 years. And this is in spite of the provocation where the Athenians and the Spartans before Marathon have each killed the Persian envoys sent to them, which Herodotus considers a major violation of proper protocol. Just how well Greeks treated outsiders is a little harder to say in this period, because this is really only when the Greeks are emerging into an era where we start to get the literature more sense of Greek culture. And how they thought about things. So you do wonder, with all the Greek colonies established amongst the wilder parts of the world as far as the Greeks were concerned, how well they treated others there. But again, we know very little about that. In Herodotus, Darius is obsessed with revenge, building up to this, but dies before he can do it, and it's left to his son Xerxes, who masses this huge army, and the preparations go on for several years. You have the canal cut through Mount Athos. Before that, the Persians have suffered heavy losses to a fleet trying to sail past when they're hit by a storm. You have huge depots of supplies set up along the route that the army is going to take, because bear in mind, most of Thrace, at least the coastal areas, and indeed probably Macedonia, are effectively parts of the Persian Empire. They have at the very least submitted. They may even be considered that, from a Persian perspective, the Macedonian king might be seen as almost a satrap rather than an independent monarch of his own. And there's certainly a Persian official with overall responsibility, as far as the Persians are concerned, of that area. Herodotus talks about, massive preparations, this vast army, this vast fleet, 1 million men, 1,200 warships, this sort of thing. Whatever we make of those numbers, and they clearly are, particularly for the number of soldiers, far too big. This was a much bigger army than the one sent in 490 BC, and very large by ancient standards, perhaps exceptionally large, perhaps even too large. It may have been that Xerxes used too big a sledgehammer and became clumsy, but at least for the advance, the Persian supply organisation seems to have worked very, very well indeed. It does restrict what the army can do, but at least it keeps them supplied. Now, in 481 BC, before Xerxes has set out, the Spartans summon representatives from other Greek states to talk about this threat, talk about what to do about it. And there's an agreement. The first meeting is probably in Sparta itself, in or near there, and the Athenians turn up, people from all over Greece, and it's a remarkably ambitious plan as far as the Greeks are concerned, because significant group of these states agree to set aside their domestic disputes, their own wars. The Athenians, for instance, have been fighting on and off with the Aetolians from an island near the Peloponnese for quite a long time, and it's been fairly bitter. That's set aside. And they also pledge not to fight each other in future. The idea is there is this sense of coming together to face this common threat. And remember that these are individual states. They recognize the others as Hellenes, as people of similar culture. There are different dialects, different branches of the Greek language, but the impression is that at least the educated could understand each other wherever they came from. Perhaps that was true more broadly of the wider population. They participate in the Olympic and the other festivals in this cycle. They consult the Pythian oracle at Delphi and other important shrines. They have a lot of aspects of cult that's in common. They all revere Homer, the Iliad, the Odyssey, poets like Hesiod, these others. So there's a lot that's in common, but they are a people rather than a nation. And in any political sense, they are separated into their distinct communities, and they think of themselves as an Athenian or as a Tegean, whatever it might be, a Corinthian, a Spartan. First, that's what really matters. So for them to come together, because they're very often hostile and they fight wars pretty bitterly against each other, this is a remarkable thing. How many agree in the first place is unclear. Eventually, by the end of the war, a monument will be set up where 31 states are recognised as having taken part right the way through, or to the bitter end, in the eventual victory over the Persians. Little bit hard to say how many there are early on. This group comes together and agrees to cooperate. It agrees to work together to face the Persians, not to fight wars against each other. And also there's talk, even at this stage, of reprisals against Greek states that do join the Persians. However, they can't really do very much more than that. This is a remarkable achievement. The basic nature of the Greek military at this time is that your armies rely first and foremost on the hoplite class. These are your citizens who have sufficient property to be able to equip themselves with bronze helmet, shield, well, bronze covered shield in most cases, or just painted sometimes, cuirass if they can afford it, spear, maybe a javelin as well, depending on what's happening, what stage we've got to at this period. Certainly early evidence is for hoplites often carrying 2 shafted weapons. There's some anyway. At least one of which was used for throwing. Greaves perhaps, arm guards perhaps, a bell cuirass perhaps, a leather or linen cuirass perhaps, a sword to back this all up, and to be willing to fight in various ways, but particularly in a critical battle, shoulder to shoulder, in the phalanx. Now again, the emphasis we place on the phalanx is distinctive, the emphasis we place on the hoplite is distinctive, is slightly going further than the words are actually used at this time in Greek literature or in the next few generations. And, for instance, we refer consistently to hoplites based on the hoplon shield. In the main, the Greeks refer to this as the aspis. So it's a lot of this, it's rather like talking about the gladius sword, or let alone invented terms like lorica segmentata for the Romans. We've imposed an order using some ancient terminology and ancient words that we've often adapted to mean things that they didn't automatically mean that and exclusively that in the Greek world itself. But these are men who are not professional soldiers. They're not full-time soldiers. They are in the main farmers. There will be in some of the bigger states craftsmen and others as well. Your aristocrats often serve in a capacity where they're referred to as knights, as equestrians, though again social pressure and the importance of the phalanx means that in the main they fight on foot with everybody else, just they have to behave in a prominent way and live up to the reputation of their family. These are armies that prove to be very good at fighting, particularly in close quarters, hand-to-hand stuff, because it is, at its best, they work together as a group, as a close formation. Again, we talked a little bit about phalanxes in the video on the films, but at some point I will do far more on this, and eventually some of the lectures I've been doing for the Pharos Institute at Oxford, they'll be up on their YouTube site as well, so you can get a taste of me talking about this stuff. But we'll do more as we go along, particularly once we're closer to the book release, and that actually happens. They go off to war not because they're primarily paid to do it or anything like that. They go off because they're a citizen, because they have status within the community, their vote matters, their opinion matters, they have legal protections within the community because they're willing to fight for that community. But they can't go off for a very long time. Wars against most other Greek states, when they escalate to the stage of a phalanx army taking the field, a phalanx battle, are fairly short. Nowhere is very far away in Greece, even if you've got to go an awkward route to get round the mountains or over the mountains to get there. You want to fight so that you can get it all sorted out before you're needed in the most labour-critical parts of the year on your farm to do the harvest, this sort of thing. So wars tend to be short, often pretty violent, with the one battle that decides everything, and then it's all over and everybody goes home. You're not soldiers that can go out, join an army and spend weeks and months campaigning, manoeuvring, trying to find the best opportunity to fight, all that sort of thing, because you've got other things to do. And even the Spartans, who have the luxury, because the Helots labour on their behalf, to train almost full-time for war, there are still limits to how far and for how long a lot of Spartans can be away from Sparta, because the Helots aren't too keen on the whole system, so you've got to be careful to keep them under control. Again, that's a big issue we can talk about another time, because there's all sorts of views on just how the Spartan state actually functions. But even the Spartans who are the best trained, the ones who really are preparing for war for much of their life, although perhaps it's better to think of them not as professional soldiers but as professional citizens, because they also carry out political things, and that there's an element of living the good life as a Greek gentleman should. And there are all sorts of views about what level of training and what type of training they're actually doing. Sparta can't afford to send a large proportion of its citizens off for a very long campaign, and certainly not for months on end as a regular thing, because they are needed at home. For the state to function, they need to be there, at least a lot of them. So even though they know that Xerxes is forming this big army, at this stage they don't know what he's going to do and when, and they don't know if he's going to try and come by sea or come by land, although there are hints with the preparations that he's coming by land. But this is not somewhere where all the states can get together and say, well, let's form an army of this set size, we'll put it in position to wait for the Persians to come, and then we'll defend Greece collectively that way. That isn't the way Greek war-making works. You can't go off for a long campaign like this. So they have to wait to see what the Persians are going to do. They don't really have a clear inkling of this until the spring of 480 BC, when Xerxes marches out from Sardis at the head of this great army and begins to process up to the Dardanelles, cross into Europe, then around the Thracian coast into Macedonia, and eventually down to Greece. That takes many months. That's a long way. And this is a big, ponderous army. Yes, you've built these bridges across the Gallipoli Strait, the Dardanelles there. You've also prepared, you've got the canal through Mount Athos, you've got these different, but it all takes time. However big the army is, it's very large, it's got a lot of camp followers, it's got the royal court travelling with them, and other officers are going to be travelling in similar style. We hear later on at Plataiaei of one whose Greek mistress is there and is captured after the battle, this sort of thing. There is a sense that when the great king goes to war, the whole state goes to war, and it's this royal procession. And part of this is deliberate. There is a great emphasis from the Persian point of view in saying, we are the mightiest power in the world. I am the great king. I am appointed by Ahura Mazda to protect the truth, the light, against darkness and the lie. So I am on earth the representative of the gods who fight the good fight against the demons and the sinister spirits of the universe, to make sure that right and truth prevails. I am mighty. I control the biggest empire in the world. I have armies that are stronger than anyone else's in greater number, and I've beaten everybody else in the world. So don't fight me. What is the point? You will lose and you will suffer. But if you give in, if you submit, then I will be generous, I will be kind, I will be a good king to you. So there is a lot of deliberate intimidation. The Persians don't keep anything secret. They want this to be a grand, inexorable, slow advance to give the Greeks plenty of time to think about it and wonder, really, do I want to oppose this? Wouldn't it just be simpler to submit, to give the earth and water? Ambassadors are going around asking for this again. And also because it's the Spartans and the Athenians who've killed Persian ambassadors, it's the Plataians and a few others who fought before, most Greek states will be thinking, well, why should I suffer for what they've done? But so around about this time, as soon as the news of this comes, there is another conference, this time held at the Isthmus of Corinth, so that narrow strip connecting the Peloponnese to the rest of Greece. And here they debate what they're going to do. And deputations come from the cities of Thessaly to the north saying, well, we'd like to fight with you, but we need to protect our homes. So will you come and fight to protect Thessaly? This is then agreed upon, and together the states assemble an army of 10,000 under Spartan command. Every major force in this war will be under Spartan command until the aftermath, because the Spartans have the highest military reputation in Greece, and they're considered to be good, but also it's appropriate for their status, for their honour. There's an element of the competition between Homeric heroes in this, that you need to be treated in a way in accordance with your proven prowess, your reputation, your past deeds, your family, your status, all of this thing. Communities think along the same way in relation to each other, and honour is very important to them. So an army of 10,000 men is assembled. So that's the same sort of size as the force that had defeated Darius at at Marathon. So that's a logical thing. You think, actually, that makes sense. That's the sort of numbers we need to oppose the Persians. It's sent to the pass of Tempe, is to the north of Thessaly, and it travels there and discovers two things when it gets there. First of all is that whilst the Tempe position is quite a strong one, a relatively small force here can hope to fight against substantially greater numbers of attackers and hold them off. The downside to this is that there are several other routes around the mountains fairly close by, so that there are other passes that means that the Persians can get around behind the Tempe position and outflank whatever army is there. So in the long run, the position is impossible to defend. The Persians will get round you, so you could fight there briefly, but then you'd have to retreat. The other thing is that they get news from, most of it from Alexander I, the king of Macedonia, who sort of plays both sides a bit, but has connections with the Athenians. He's probably been the man who's been selling the Athenians lots of the timber they've used to build the fleet that will allow them to win the Battle of Salamis a few years later. Later this summer, but from 283 onwards. That's when the big shipbuilding program begins under Themistocles' leadership in Athens. Again, it's another very, very big issue. He tells them two things. One is that the Persians are still a long, long way away. Xerxes is nowhere near approaching you, which means that you'd have to wait weeks and weeks at Tempe if you were going to fight there at all. And again, it comes back to the thing, these are all part-time soldiers. They cannot do this. They simply can't go out for a prolonged campaign like this. The other thing he tells them is that the Persian army is a lot bigger than they expect. Than they'd expected. It is really massive. He gives them some idea of Persian numbers. Again, this is serving the Persian cause as well, because he's a vassal, really, of the Persian great king. So intimidating the enemy and convincing them to give in, to quit, to negotiate, and accept the mercy of the great king, that all helps to achieve the objectives that you're after. So the Greeks learn that there's loads of Persians coming, but they're not coming for a long time, that they'd have to wait to fight a battle, but which they can't do. But even if they did, the position would soon be turned. So, having achieved nothing at all, the army retreats, dispersing to its home communities, because it simply cannot stay. So, this coalition can't form an army of 10,000 men and then keep it in the field indefinitely. It's not capable of doing that. Even if the men were willing to go, they couldn't be supplied. But the other thing to remember about Greece is that Greece is not very big. So what you're doing most of the time is waiting to see what the Persians are planning, what they're actually doing, and then reacting to that. You can form an army relatively quickly because, again, everybody just had to get down their equipment from over the fireplace or wherever they keep it, muster in groups from their home city, march from their home city to join the army wherever it's going. Greece is a small country. Yes, there are lots of hills, mountains in the way that means you can rarely go in a straight line anywhere, but it doesn't take long to form an army, to concentrate it, and that's what they have to wait to do. So after the retreat from Tempe, for weeks, month or more, the Greeks can't really do anything. They're waiting to see what happens next. What do the Persians do? When the Persians finally arrive and move at a leisurely pace, Xerxes advances into Thessaly. The Thessalian communities switch sides, defect to him because they can't hope to fight the Persians on their own, and a lot of Thessaly is a bit more open. It's good cavalry country, so although the Thessalian horse is well respected, they don't have the numbers to face up to the substantial numbers of high quality cavalry that the Persians have. So it's a lesson in groups saying, well, we'll fight as long as you'll fight with us, but we can't fight on our own. No one's willing or able to fight with the Thessalians anymore, so therefore the Thessalians switch sides. The Persian army lumbers on. The Greeks think about what to do again, and this time they look at the position at Thermopylae, the hot gates, the pass there. Now this is to protect the next significant region, as it were, of Greece, south of Thessaly, Boeotia. The Thebans are obviously they're the big community, the big city there. There are lots of others as well, and the question is the same. If you're not willing to fight to protect their land, why should they fight to protect yours? So if you're just going to retreat, if you're not going to make any stand to the north, then they're just going to defect, just as the Thessalians has done, and the momentum will be with the Persians. More and more Greeks will join them, and your chances of keeping any coalition together get less and less. So although the instinct is for everybody to defend their homeland, particularly the Peloponnesians, who see the Isthmus of Corinth as a defensible position, then they realise they're able to be persuaded that, look, well, if you just wait for that, then everybody else is going to switch sides, so you'll have fewer and fewer people to defend that position. At this stage, they have not significantly begun fortifications across the Isthmus of Corinth. That happens in the main after Thermopylae. So although there are people obviously arguing for this sort of thing, and this is the approach if they happen to live in the Peloponnese, there is also the perception that, well, that's fine, but what about everybody else? What are they going to do? For the Athenians, after the pass at Thermopylae, and once the Persian army gets past that, there is no real choke point. There's no position that is anything like as favourable to meet the Persians between there and Attica. It's armies move back and forth from Boeotia to Attica and the south relatively easily. It's more open. It's why there are so many Greek battles fought in the region there, and it's called the dancing floor of Ares and all this sort of thing later on. So the Allies agree to form a second field army, but this one is significantly smaller. It's maybe 5,000 to 7,000 men as opposed to 10,000 men. But there is a big difference. The pass of Tempe wasn't near the sea, didn't have the threat of the Persians landing on the shore and outflanking you that way. Thermopylae is right by the seashore, and it opens onto the strait with the island of Euboea. So it's not just an army that's sent this time. A major fleet goes as well, initially of 271 triremes, the threes, the sort of basic warship of the day. Later increases to over 300, because some of the Athenian ships don't get there right at the start. Some of them are manned like Plataians as well at this point. There's some on loan from the Athenians. So that's actually a bigger commitment of people than had been the case before, because triremes have large crews in proportion to their size. So there are tens of thousands of men on top of the army you've sent with the fleet, even if most of them are rowers who tend to be the poorer citizens, don't fight as hoplites in quite such a significant way on land, tend to have a subordinate skirmishing role. So this is still a big commitment, and the pass at Thermopylae is particularly narrow, so the number of troops there are adequate to defend it for at least a while. The fleet is there to stop the Persians embarking troops on their big fleet, sailing round behind the pass by passing it that way. So two states are notable by the small commitment, the apparently small commitment to the field army. There's only 300 Spartans, famously, because the Spartans, as they were before Marathon, and the reason why the 2,000 Spartans sent there don't arrive in time for the battle, they're celebrating a festival. That's at least the public reason. They're doing it again. Somehow they work out that they can spare 300 men, perhaps because there's a representative family. This whole thing about them taking men with sons might be part of it, led by Leonidas. Now, you have... Some people will argue for this being a sort of suicide mission, a forlorn hope. You're basically going as a token to show that you're still willing to stand with the Greeks, but not really, because you're not sending many people. It's complicated by the Delphic oracle reported by Herodotus that talks about the Spartans being told that either their state's going to be destroyed or a king will die. And of course Leonidas, one of the two kings, does die at Thermopylae. Some people would say, well, that means the oracle's probably invented afterwards to explain this. On the other hand, others would say, well, if that's what they had been told, is this a token thing? Let's try and sort of clear ourselves that way, protect the city by a king sacrificing himself with a small group of picked citizens. But there's no reason to believe that. This is actually a very reasonable response to the situation, because again, the Greeks can muster an army of 5,000 to 7,000. They can actually feed that for rather longer if it stays in place. In fact, things will be over in a matter of days, but they don't know that. At the very least, they can hope to delay the Persians at Thermopylae because of the nature of the position. Now, as at Tempe, they'll find when they get there that there is another route around, but this one far less well known than the ones at Tempe, and more difficult, though of course it does prove the undoing of them. They're flanked by the sea, is protected by the fleet that goes there, and when you add in those fleet numbers, this is a lot of people. That's the reason the Athenians don't send any soldiers to Thermopylae, is they've sent an awful lot of their citizens, rich and poor, to join the fleet at Artemisium, which is about 40 miles from Thermopylae. It's on the shore of the island of Euboea. So you're in that narrower strait, which is perceived by the Greeks to give them some advantage. Now, there is a famous inscription called the Decree of Themistocles, which is set down in the 3rd century BC, so much, much later than the 5th. Purports to record decisions made and passed by the assembly of the Athenians on proposals of Themistocles before the Thermopylae Artemisium campaign. And this talks about sending ships to Artemisium, though initially only half the Athenian fleet, the other half's going to be kept back in case things happen elsewhere. It talks about preparations for evacuating Attica, which will happen post-Thermopylae. People have argued over its authenticity. I think the balance of opinion is that it is basically reliable, but that some of it may have been distorted and changed afterwards. But there's some very interesting and peculiar features. So not only is there that division between only half the fleet goes to Artemisium first, but also the ships that go there have 100 rowers each, rather than the 170 that appears to be standard, at least for Athenian triremes later in the 5th century, and the basis of the Olympias reconstruction, all that sort of thing. So it's an indication that a lot of these ships may not all have been of uniform size, but also that you could operate them effectively with a good crew without the full theoretical complement. Having 2/3 of your crew might well work pretty well if they're very good and well trained and well motivated, and that probably this is affecting the enemy as well. So even if we reduce it to the number of ships, 300 or so ships, and everybody's got 100 rowers on board plus some deck crew, that's 30,000 plus. Still a lot of people are sent there. So the idea that this is just a sacrifice, just a token gesture, doesn't really work. And again, the reason why they're not sending a bigger army is that you can't feed it. You cannot keep it in the field for any length of time. The Plataiaei campaign will be a fairly short one in 479 BC, and that will stretch the resources, and the Greeks are running out of food, and some of the manoeuvres are to do with food and water supply, part because the Persians are threatening it, but also there's an attack on a convoy of food that is coming to the Greek army, and the Persians destroy that in the sort of build-up to the battle. Even though the distances are fairly short in Greece, it still becomes a challenge because states are not organised to form large armies and keep them in the field for a long time, even if the men are willing to do that, and often they have other things to do and other priorities. So you can't mass together an army and then keep it there and wait and then slowly engage in a long campaign, choose your moment to fight the Persians when you've got the best chance. That's just not practical in the Greek context. So what they do is delay the Persians and find out what's going to happen next. And, if they're really lucky, the Persians are blocked at Thermopylae, maybe they'll quit and go home. Unlikely, but you never know. At the very least, it gives you time for the Spartan festival to be completed, and then for you to say, okay, we know where they're going, they're nearly in Attica now, let's form a big army, let's go and fight them. They do fight them outside Plataiaei eventually in the following year. That doesn't happen because Leonidas and his men last for 3 days before they're outflanked, and then the Spartans, the Thespians, what's left of them, and the Thebans hold out. Some of the Thebans, significant numbers of them, eventually surrender. Everybody else is wiped out. But that has given time. The problem is then, well, what do we do? How do we stop the Persians? Bear in mind, although they've done quite well at Thermopylae, and we tend to emphasize this as well, this shows just how good Greek hoplites were when they came face to face with Persian soldiers. They tended to win. The end result is that everybody retreats or dies, and the Persians have outflanked the position. So although you can think individually, yeah, 1-to-1, we can take these people on, there's a lot of Persians out there. So what you're going to do, this is when you'll lead into the debate over let's defend the Isthmus of Corinth. The Peloponnesians want to fortify this, build a wall across it, and hope that they can stop the Persians there. The Athenians will then have their trump card saying, well, they've abandoned Attica, they've gone to Salamis and elsewhere, taken virtually everybody away. The Persians are able to burn down their temples, slight the walls of the city, ravage the area, this sort of thing. We've sacrificed this, but if you still want our fleet, you've got to be willing to fight on our terms. Otherwise, we'll clear off and go and settle in Italy or somewhere like that. There are debates. I mean, again, we should look at the Greek alliance against the Persians and not think, oh, well, in the wider world there's nearly 1,000 Greek states, how come just 31 stand shoulder to shoulder and beat the Persians? Isn't that rather disappointing? We should actually say, wow, it's incredible that this group of fiercely independent and incredibly competitive people, actually 31 of them do group together and they wobble, they argue, there are divisions of council, but they do stand together and they do fight and they do beat the Persians. Again, we accept this as, well, that was inevitable, that was going to happen. This shocked everybody, including the Greeks themselves. They really were up against the only superpower in the world, and somehow or other they managed to defeat it. And yes, it was normal to dedicate things to the gods in the aftermath of victory, but you do feel there's a real sense of, wow, how did that happen? How did we manage to do that? We thought we were going to put up a good show and try, but to succeed, to win in those circumstances was incredible. And familiarity with the events tends to weaken that. So I hope through looking at this, we've tried to present the defence of Greece in a different way. There are severe restrictions on what the Greeks are able to do, and the biggest one is that they simply cannot put a large army into the field for any length of time. So that really gives the initiative to the Persians. The Greeks have to wait to see what they're doing and then assemble a force and try and respond to it. And this they managed to do, and they managed to fight on their terms at sea at Salamis and then on land at Plataiaei, though Plataiaei is a fairly confusing, almost accidental battle. So hopefully that puts that into context. I've put a few suggestions for reading where you can have different views. You can read someone who thinks that this was a suicide mission, this was a token, and the Spartans are just doing the minimum to keep their credit, but really more interested in defending their own homeland and the Peloponnese in general. And I think more convincing arguments that actually say, no, this is simply the limitations of what they can do, and that they're doing their best, but they don't. Again, we can't think of them as a modern state with united and with a modern army that you can basically send out into the field. This isn't like the Roman army will be later on. It's a different society that's producing this. So anyway, there's some thoughts on the Greek response to the Persian invasion in 480 BC. Thanks for watching.